talk in July and was frankly rather nervous to be in front of such an august body. And I have to say, it's one of my favorite talks I've given in the last few years. And when we suggested coming back, we brainstormed a little bit about what I could bring you. And he said, what about snow? And I thought, fantastic. I have never given a talk about snow. So you all have the, I don't know if it's the privilege or the burden of having the world premiere of this particular presentation. It is, as I hope you'll see, a profoundly important element in city life, of course. But it's erratic and it's seasonal, so it doesn't occupy our thoughts quite as much as other elements of the relationship of the city with its nature. So I'm delighted to be here. I do want to encourage you, if you need a refill at all while I'm talking, don't hesitate. We have another 50 people. And this is my thank you to you for actually coming out on a very cold night. So I'm delighted that you're here. I want to start, as I often do, by locating us. The A, that's where we are right now. And this arrow is pointing to something called the New York Bight, spelled B-I-G-H. B-I-G-H-T. A bight is simply a curve in a shoreline or an indentation in a coastline. But you notice that in our particular corner here, it's a very sharp angle. In fact, as the Jersey Shore and the south shore of Long Island define lower New York Harbor and Raritan Bay, it's actually a perfect right angle. And this is a really important geographic feature to know when considering the effect of storms on our location. New York City is at the right inside the funnel. So when storms come up, they hit this right angle, and instead of spinning out, they get stuck, especially in conditions, as I'll describe, for historically significant storms like 1888 and 2010. Snow has always featured in our understanding of ourselves as a city. These are illustrations from 1860 on Lower Broadway. One of the techniques of dealing with snow back then was not to plow it, but to press it with these rollers that were pulled by teams of horses, so that sleigh-based transport would move efficiently while the snow was on the ground. I sometimes wonder if we shouldn't think about bringing that back. The horses struggled, of course, in snow, especially when there were teams, multi-teams. If one horse went down, you had problems with that entire piece of transportation. But the defining snow event in city history, I would say even more so than 2010, was the blizzard of 1888, which I'm going to discuss a little bit right now. This is a meteorological account of what happened, and you see, this is a very old illustration, so it's not quite as tight as I would like, but you see how the New York Bight, it funnels into us. There was a front coming down from the north, and a front going across the southern part of the U.S. The one that came across the south hit the Atlantic Ocean and took a turn north, and it met the one coming down from Canada, and it all settled right over New York City. It didn't just completely befuddle the weather forecasters of the day, as you may imagine in 1888. They weren't that sophisticated, but no one saw this coming. On Sunday evening, March 11th, everybody went to bed under the assumption that spring was springing, the crocuses were up, the trees were beginning to bud. It was the mildest winter in 17 years, when people assumed it was done. During the night, that rain turned into snow, and the wind picked up to speeds of as strong as 80 miles an hour, and the snow consumed the city. This is 11th Street, as you see. Pay attention to the wires. I'm going to talk about those more in just a minute. This is accounts of this particular storm. People saw the snow in the morning, but they still had to go to work, so they would trudge out into the blizzard, and in many cases not get where they were going, or they would get there and then be completely unable to come home. Across the eastern seaboard, there were 400 fatalities, 200 of which were here in New York City. But this method of preventing frostbite of your ears is to take the snow and rub it in the ear, rub it on your ears. That seems counterintuitive to me. I would have to talk to someone with more medical expertise than I have. This is Madison Avenue near 50th Street. The storm lasted until Wednesday. When people woke up on Monday morning, the snow had already accumulated to such depths and been buffeted by such ferocious winds that the snow in some cases was up to the second floor of buildings, especially on the north sides of the street. This is also another shot of 11th Street. This is Park Place in Brooklyn. I'm not sure where this is, except I know it's in Manhattan. 14th Street at, yeah, East 20 West. Now again, look at the telegraph and telephone poles. All the communication and electrical infrastructure in the city was above us. I apologize for the quality of this particular image, but I wanted to include it so you could see that this is not a snowy day. This is just an illustration of a normal day in Lower Manhattan, the Wall Street area. And then this is what happens when you dump tons and tons of snow upon it. This is Wall Street. And if you look carefully, you can see Trinity Church in the background there, right? So these wires and these telephone poles didn't all collapse, but a lot of them did. And what held them up were, the wires themselves wrapped around the insulators held them up, but not very securely. And you see on the right side of this illustration, the poles actually fall into windows, right? This is the piling. What are you going to do with all this snow? You have to move it out of the way, but it's going to sit there for a while. You can cart it off. The Commissioner of Street Cleaning, which was even then the agency responsible for snow removal, like sanitation is today, that's the precursor to sanitation. The Commissioner of Street Cleaning estimated that there were 13 million cubic yards of snow south of 42nd Street, and at 2 cubic yards per cart, that was an awful lot of snow to remove by horse and cart. An average storm, he said, would be about 10,000 cartloads. This was significantly more than that. All of the available carts were put to use, including carts that they hired from private companies, but then different businesses and neighborhoods would also hire private cars to take away the snow for a lot more money than the city paid. So the infrastructure of snow removal back then was mostly completely ineffectual. This is worth looking at just because, of course, the language of the press back in the 1880s and 1890s was far different than what it is today. And I'm not going to read that, but I think it's a lovely example. And then this one, I especially highlighted Coleman's stupendous task. Coleman was the commissioner of street cleaning. And there were many infrastructural and policy changes that came out of the storm, like finally putting all of that wiring of electricity and telegraph and telephone, once it came, underground. Also then deciding finally to embrace the idea of putting the railroads underground. That was part of the genesis of New York City's subway system. It had been an idea that had been around for a while, but no one embraced it enough to make it real. This storm was a big catalyst for that. And also, the ineptitude of the city's response in clearing the snow, the ineffectual labors of street cleaning were a big part of how reform happened only 6 years later, and I'll talk about that in a minute, 8 years later. If you want more sources about 1988, here are 3 good ones. The last one, YA, that's a young adult novel, and that's the kind of book to give to like an 8 or 10-year-old. If you want these later, talk to me after, and I'll give them to you. So the storm comes, the city is devastated, there are deaths, there's tremendous loss of life at sea. The infrastructure and daily life of New York is completely upended for a long time. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks to recover. Many changes are then instituted. And when there's a reform mayor elected in 1895 who appoints a reformist commissioner of street cleaning, one of his first tasks, this guy, George Waring, is a big snowstorm that comes about 2 weeks after he arrives, and he's on it. To the point where the press said, it seemed that Waring's men caught the snow before it fell. And so he's filling carts and sending them to the rivers to be dumped, which we don't do anymore, but even then was a controversial way of getting rid of the snow. And he had them in white, like this guy. This photograph and this one are both by Alice Austin, who has a beautiful series of pictures of just everyday life in New York. You can access it through the New York Public Library Digital Archive. They have a beta system in place right now that I encourage you to play with. You can look at these as a book. It flips each one as a book. There are organ grinders and mail deliverers and police officers and all kinds of regular folks like the street cleaners. They were not in white to blend in with the snow. This was a way of making sure his workers had a certain kind of respect and also were easier to surveil if they were going to sneak off to a pub. It was harder to do in the bright weather. The guy who's not in uniform is probably a hired laborer. Since forever, when New York City is hit by snow, the city reaches out and says, do you want to make a few extra bucks? Come and get a shovel and help us clear. It happens even today. It happened in the storm that we went through last week. This illustration, if you come across it at the NYPL collection, it will tell you that's a police officer. Not so. He's wearing a white helmet, which means he's a Department of Street Cleaning foreman or supervisor who has authority to give receipts to private guys who are hauling snow on behalf of the city, who then need to take that receipt to get paid for the load that they're carrying. But it's not a police officer. I just want that little correction on the record so that if you come across these illustrations, you will know the real story. It was and is a great way to make money. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the controversies of who does it as a private carter and who does it as a municipal employee and who decides, who makes that decision. This particular picture is well known within sanitation. It's on the walls of several different facilities. It's showing what's called tandem plowing. You have one plow in the middle of the street and another one behind it slightly to the right. And the plows are angled in such a way that both plows together will actually clear the entire street. This is a strategy that we still use.
Were they iron or steel?
Which, the plows?
Yeah.
I don't know. Interesting question. We'll find out.
And I'm sorry, but the horses, it was assumed, could just get through the drifts and pull the plows behind them? I mean, was there difficulty there? There must
Yes, there was. And
okay.
Just as today, when the snow reaches a certain depth, and especially if it's a dry light snow is going to be easier to move than a heavy wet snow. So if you have a foot of dry white versus a foot of heavy wet, the physics of it are quite different, and you have different sorts of struggles. And yes, sometimes the horses, they couldn't get through, just like today sometimes the plows can't get through. Then you have to do layers. You script like peeling an onion. You get down a few inches at a time, and then you move forward to another section and go a few inches at a time, which is of course very tedious and slow. So the early 20th century, we've had snow since look at where we are geographically, we have snow. 1888 stands as the most extreme storm we have had in winter, according to meteorologists, since 500 some odd years, back before they kept records. It's a once in a half a millennium storm. At least that's what they used to say. This is 1908. I like this little montage of Manhattan locations. This is 1910. And then you're going to see a slow transition to motorized equipment. This is 1912. This is one of the first V plows. I'll talk about those a little bit more, but I like that there's this phalanx of dignitaries and onlookers to inaugurate the V plow, which is a more effective mechanism in some conditions. So this, you'll see there's no windshield. I did wonder about, in some of these earlier plows, like many cars and trucks at the time, the driver is pretty unprotected. I try to imagine what it would be like to have that job back then, and how interesting it would be to learn this contraption, and how damn cold you'd be with it flying into your face, and how did they make that work? This is from 1920. This is on West Street. So you see that even though we have mechanized equipment coming in, the horse and cart is still key to the city's response, even as late as 1920. And in fact, the Department of Sanitation didn't fully mechanize across all of its responsibilities until 1934. This is 1926 on 5th Avenue. Again, you have a proud set of people standing next to this, this newfangled equipment. This is the beginnings of a snow melter. You put the snow goes up the conveyor belt, and then either can be put into a truck or put into a melter contraption. There's a lovely story in the New York Times from the 1870s of I didn't put it into this talk because it's kind of long, but it's this gorgeously humorous narrative of this snow melter contraption looking around for a source of water to boil to melt the snow, and all of the mishaps that happen along the way. It's sort of a Keystone Cop tries to melt snow story. But this is the kind of, it's almost like a Rube Goldberg sort of invention here, but because you're always looking for better ways to solve the problem, right? This is from the 1930s, so we're getting a little more, you have a windshield, things are a little more slick. But pay attention to the plow apparatus, because it's not so different today from that. This is also from the same era. That has wheels on it that will make it smoother. We don't use wheels anymore. We have plow shoes, which protect the edge of the blade to varying degrees. Some people say one of the reasons that the response of the department recently has seemed a little troubled is that the shoe is too tall. So the plow can't get to the asphalt. Maybe. We'll talk about that in a minute. 1947, that's the next big storm. Now, of course, as you saw, there was a lot of snow in between, but this is the biggest storm after 1888. And these illustrations I'm going to show you for this storm are all from Life magazine. They were not published, but they're now available. And gorgeous pictures. And I like this storm not because it was more than 26 inches and 77 deaths, but because this storm elicited a very impressive outpouring of thanks and gratitude to the Department of Sanitation for the response. That is not normal. The role of snow is either neutral or negative. If snow is cleared well, the department doesn't get a lot of grief. If there's a problem, everybody piles on, no pun intended. And in this particular storm, the letters, they're handwritten, they're hand-typed. There's a file of them in sanitation in what stands right now for the archives. And it's heartwarming to read them. People took the time to send a thank you note. Lots of people. Aren't these beautiful? Now, this was not 1947. This is from 1962. V-plows again, but much bigger. Massive, very mighty things.
Is that on Randall's Island?
That's very likely on Randall's Island, yes. It's from a publication no longer in sanitation called Sweep, which was a quarterly magazine that was actually very high quality. That's from the cover. But so this, I don't know what kind of cavalry of V-plows John Lindsay had available to him when, in February of 1969, predictions of light rain and a slight chance of snow turned into a walloping 15 to 18 inches from a Sunday into a Monday. Now, how many of you were here in New York then and remember that storm? Yeah, it was a memorable one for many reasons. A little bit of the short story of that storm is that it cost Lindsay his endorsement from the Republican Party for his re-election, and he had to run on a fusion ticket. He won, but by barely, and it was one of the signs of how his ambitions kind of fell flat in ways large and small, and it may have cost him much more in his future political career. The inside story of that storm is that he had just created this Uber agency that was meant to make the city bureaucracy much more efficient. And underneath the umbrella of this Uber agency were many formerly independent city departments, including sanitation. The guy who was the head of that new agency was out of town. The snow arrives. Nobody can find this guy. So there's no one who will step forward and make the call to send out the plows. It was also the case in 1969 that as much as half of the department's equipment was down. So even if they had sent out all the plows, it's half what they should have been able to send. The union had struck the year before, Sanitation Workers Union, and Lindsay and the union did not play well together in the negotiations, and it in fact took Rockefeller stepping in to fix things. So there was some talk that the union dragged their feet in responding to the storm as payback for Lindsay. That part I've never had confirmed anywhere. I don't want to say it's not true, but the other elements of the problem I think were bigger ones. He did finally, he went to Queens, which was the most abandoned and the angriest of the boroughs. He took his limousine, got stuck in the snow, they moved to a four-wheel drive, got stuck in the snow, finally he's out walking, and he's in his fancy loafers that of course got ruined immediately. And he was booed, people threw snowballs at him, people cursed him, they called him all kinds of names, and at one point, a woman said something complimentary to him, like as a break in this barrage of criticism. And he didn't realize that the tape recorders of the accompanying press were still running. And he said to this woman something like, "Well, you're a lot nicer to me than those fat Jewish broads in the other neighborhood." He had already been accused of anti-Semitism. Now, in a mark of how media in '69 is a little different than media in 2000 or whatever, every outlet that had that on record agreed not to air it, not to print it, for better or worse. But I've always been interested that in that sort of tiny moment of media history of how different the treatment of the politician was back then. It did air on every national newscast that night of poor Lindsay stumbling through the snow, getting snowballs thrown at him and his shoes wrecked. So he still suffered, his image suffered greatly from that storm. But at least that one particular remark, that would have been the death blow to his career. Maybe it should have been. I'm not arguing either way, but it's an interesting side note. So we're going to jump forward to the current day. When you are working for the Department of Sanitation and it's July, one of the things you have to think about if you are in any kind of managerial position is snow. Because it's during the off-season that you're going to make sure all your equipment is in good order, that those shoes on the plows, if they need replacing, or if the blades have to be stripped down and re-ground. This is how they're stored in these kinds of beautiful big orange parentheses. These are both in Manhattan 9. That's my art shot. It doesn't show so well. I really like it lighting on that, but it's not so practical. You see this smaller plow and this smaller, it's kind of like a mini spreader, and I'll talk about those in a minute. This is where you get into tighter corners and alleys and back streets that are maybe too tight for a full plow. This is in the Bronx. This is called, the whole thing is called the mold board that holds the plow itself. There are 48 parts that go into each plow, and it by itself it weighs a ton. It's a 2,000-pound object. You lift it and position it with a forklift, or as they say on the job, a high-low.
Does it come as an assembled unit, and is it done to city specs, or is it common to any?
It's done to city specs. If it comes, Marty, do you know if it comes assembled or if, yeah, it comes pre-assembled. But during maintenance, during the summer, each one is checked and sometimes taken all the way apart and put back together again. If a bolt has become worn, or if, you know. But it is, all city equipment is done to city specs. We don't get anything just off the shelf. Almost nothing just off the shelf. The chains, big controversy in the 2010 storm. We used different kinds of chains. Was the alloy strong enough? Was the weight and the width sufficient? This is a huge cotter pin. The slang for this on the job is the bull prick. I thought it was something worse than that, in fact, and then I said prick because they're talking to me and they're being polite. The actual proper slang is the bull prick. But so the cotter pin, this is what actually holds the apparatus onto the truck. Now these are spreaders. The big orange things you see, they have salt in the back and these spindles. This is the slang for where the calcium chloride sits in these tanks on either side, those are the saddlebags, and it comes down the back. Hold on, I'll get to, no, I'll show you that in a minute. So it comes down the back, and there's a spindle that spreads it. The spindle setting is determined by headquarters, and it's uniform across the city. So that's a little bit of a problem if it's not snowing so hard in the Bronx, or it's snowing harder. You use salt under certain conditions. You don't salt just because it's going to snow. Below a certain temperature, salt actually makes roads more treacherous because it melts the initial layer of ice and snow, which then freezes, and so you've created something far more slick than what was there in the first place. So you can't just say, oh, it's going to snow, send out the spreaders. You have to gauge the ferocity of the storm, how quickly it's snowing. You have to second guess how quickly it's going to keep snowing. There's a lot of gambling in planning the snowstorm response. During the summer, again, you're going to go through all this equipment, and if anything needs to be repaired, it's going to be fixed. The belt that keeps there's a pile of salt in the back of this vehicle, this equipment, and then the calcium chloride keeps it from clumping so that it is spreadable instead of you have these sort of boulders that jam up the works. And this conveyor belt is what keeps all that running. So the belt is pulled out. I love these pictures because it's like just like this huge tongue, and you don't when you see the actual spreader on the, you don't think about the sophistication and the complexity of the equipment. This is the back where the spindle would be, and that's where the salt comes out. Now, when you first sit in the spreader, you don't know what you're doing, so you have to be taught. This is training. I talk about this particular instructor, the guy on the far left. His name is Mo Ragusa. He's a key figure in my book. He was sort of our pattern. When I was doing research for the book, I took the job and he was my teacher. One of the people who taught me how to drive the truck. And then also, this is called snow school. There are various elements of snow school where you plow, you tandem plow in the middle of June down an empty runway at Floyd Bennett Field. And everybody's like looking at each other like, well, this is how. But it actually teaches you a little bit about the relationship of your vehicle next to the other vehicles. And you also learn how to do things like put the chains on the tires efficiently and quickly. This is not 100% proper because those bungees, one should wrap, well, there are various opinions about this, but I was taught that the one that crosses the first should wrap around it on its way to the other side. If you do it too tightly, the chains cut into the tires and you pop a tire. If you do it too loose, they come off. And the instructors tell us these horror stories of tire chains flying off the truck in the middle of a snowstorm and garroting some passerby. That's there, that could be your aunt, that could be your mother. So we're all terrified. Perfect. And then you have to learn how to maneuver this piece of equipment down city streets. This is in the West Village. A truck, a spreader always has a plow on it. A truck does not always have a plow on it. When you learn how to drive a truck, you become familiar with the object in space and its turning radius and its sort of the physics of it. I mean, those of you who drive a car, you have a sense of yourself in motion. When you put a plow on the front, it's a whole different thing. Your turning radius is different. Your weight is different. I don't care if you have chains on, you're probably going to get stuck at some point, as I did more than once. And there was this poor lady with a gold Cadillac. She was sure it was toast. We were okay, but barely. This is another of the smaller, their nicknames are, and Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, Marty Ballou is a retired sanitation guy, which is why I'm referring to him for some of this. It's a holster truck or a love truck, right?
Holster.
Holster truck, okay. Holster, not hol, I thought it was holster, like it's holster, H-A-U-L-S-T-E-R. Now, in the back of the spreader is the salt. The salt comes from a mine in Chile. It is brought up here by ships. It's offloaded, it used to be offloaded in Red Hook. I don't know if that's still true. And it comes to us in these massive tractor trailers. And then we have it staged all over the city, covered. It used to be uncovered. Now it's all covered. This is outside Manhattan 3. This is Manhattan 3 is down on the East River, just under the near the Manhattan Bridge anchorage. This is serves the Manhattan 2 and 4 garages. 2 is the West Village, garage. As you see, it's completely covered. The mound outside is just waiting to be put inside with this this piece of equipment, which is called an FEL, or a front end loader. Those are really fun because they're articulated in the middle, and so the front goes this way and the back goes that way. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to make a big mess. And a really skilled FEL operator, well, I'll show you at the end. It's like watching somebody choreographically dancing with the machinery. So then this is from the President's Day storm of 2003. Now, the snow comes down, the department responds, people are out there working, mandatory. If you had a vacation day scheduled, tough. If you had a day off, because if you're a sanitation worker, you don't get 2 days off in a row. You usually always get Sunday, and then you get one other day that's determined by a very complicated system called the chart system. So if it's your chart day, your 1 day off, tough. You're coming in. When you are hired by sanitation, they will tell you when it snows, we own you. And until it snows, you don't have any idea what they mean. But then when it snows, you're on the job for 12 hours, 7 days a week, until the snow is cleared and until the garbage is cleared. Because of course, while the department is responding to snow, we, the public, we're still putting out our trash. And it gets quite high. These are the two guys on the Upper West Side. And I have to say, hanging out with them that day was a real treat, because I would have looked at this and been just, I would have just, I don't know, sat down and stopped moving. And they're like, yeah, we're gonna get fine. This is what it is. We're chasing garbage now. And yeah, the wall of it was taller than they are. Litter baskets. Basket collection is a specific job. People put on baskets, have a route that starts at one point and finishes at another, and when they're done, they go back to the beginning and start over. It's the ultimate Sisyphusian labor, but not when it snows. But we still stuff the baskets. This is a basket that is coned, meaning that it now looks kind of like an ice cream cone. Remember the V-plows, how they grew? This is what we have now. This is this mighty, really oddly beautiful sculptural attachment that goes on the front of a truck. This is the commissioner. This was February a year ago. He's helping a V-plow driver in Queens who's completely lost. This is a snow melter, a contemporary snow melter. The FEL, the front end loader, scoops it up and puts it into this, it sort of looks like a boiling cauldron. And it's positioned over sewer caps, and it goes into the wastewater treatment system, and it's treated as sewer water is before it's released into the river. Unless the system is overwhelmed, because of course New York City has a combined sewage overflow system, which is left over from the 19th century. If we were designing it from scratch, it would be the last choice we would make, but that's what we have. So unless the system is overwhelmed, like when it's rained very heavily for several days, it's all treated before it's going into the river. And snow, at this point, it doesn't overwhelm the system. So this, just by comparison, a conventional plow and a V-plow. Now, this is tandem plowing today, meaning this is what it looks like if you were doing this job now. This is from the 2010 blizzard, and I want to talk about that for just a minute. This is also from the 2010 blizzard. The department stepped forward for that storm, just like it does for every storm. They saw the forecast. They canceled leaves. It was Christmas. They said, that's too bad, you're working. And they, as the snow arrived on the 26th, they had everything ready. And they stepped forward into, it's like doing battle. You step forward into battle. The 2010 storm, the forecast, if you go back and look at the forecast, it said, no, it's going out to sea. Oh, no, it's coming into shore. Oh, it's okay, it's going out to sea. Oh, no, it's coming into shore. Oh, no, it's going to, all day. And then finally, when it landed on shore, just a little north of us as the epicenter, it was reminiscent of the 1888 blizzard. You had a cold front that came down and stopped. You had warm air from the south that got to the ocean and then moved north, everything combined. And it's like when a car stalls, but you keep pushing the engine and it just revs higher and higher. So there were problems right away with plows getting stuck. The order at the time was that if you're in a plow that's stuck, you must stay with your equipment. But there were eventually so many plows stuck in so many parts of the city, something like 256 plows. They didn't have enough wreckers to go and get people unstuck. They would sometimes send another truck that would also get stuck. In a few cases, you had 3 stuck trucks in one place, and the order is stay with your plow. But you're not being pulled out of that situation, in some cases, for 12 hours. So guess what? You fall asleep, head against the window, and the guy with the cell phone comes by and sees evidence of city malfeasance and lazy-ass sandmen and these, and they take a picture and it's on the front page of probably the Post, but the news also. The charge that sanitation intentionally botched that storm response still makes people on the job angry. Snow is so foundational to the job. And so the understanding is this is an emergency situation, and it is our duty to step forward. And the idea that they would purposely not do the job or purposely not plow. If you live in a neighborhood and you see a plow passing and their plow is not dropped, call 311. But I bet you there's some reason. You don't necessarily know it, and it's not necessarily evident. But there's some reason. Maybe it's an order that wasn't thought through, or that wasn't appropriate for a particular context, or it was appropriate 2 hours ago and now the situation's changed a little bit. I'm not saying sanitation is flawless, but the integrity of the department, they take great pride in how well, mostly, they respond to snow. And so the idea that they would intentionally botch it, they get quite angry about that. When I talked to the commissioner after the 2010 storm, he told me it was the only time in his 50-some-odd-year career that he really seriously considered resigning. Because it was one thing after another. And the primary problem was that the storm overwhelmed what the city had in place at the time. It did, just as the '88 storm prompted changes, the 2010 storm prompted changes, small changes that now every plow and every truck has GPS over the objections of the union. But they couldn't stand in the way of that after the storm, and when the city council hearings hammered sanitation and the union for the department's response. This picture is from the storm last week that also had people kind of up in arms on the Upper East Side and parts of Staten Island. As I said earlier, responding to snow is always a gamble. The idea is that you will not spend excessively, but you will do whatever is necessary to meet the challenge. Where's the balance in that call? And if you call it wrong, things get messy quickly. What I haven't heard in the criticism about the Upper East Side response is the role of the DOT. They, according to some people I've talked to, lost the 59th Street Bridge because there were accidents that they couldn't clear quickly, and then that funneled out to the Upper East Side, and then you had you know what is a snafu? You know what the acronym stands for?
Yes.
This was a FUBAR. You know FUBAR? Okay. And there are certainly, it's essential in whenever that kind of problem develops that it is recognized and that whatever caused it is understood so that it can be prevented going forward. But that it was only sanitation's fault, I can't quite accept, and that it was easier to pile on sanitation because of the 2010 storm, I think is the case. We need to yell and point fingers, and that's now almost, I don't want to say a habit, but it could become a habit. We don't know the full story on what happened last week. I'm going to bet we'll have a chance to see it happen again, not a mess up, but for sanitation to step forward and do it right, as they almost always do. Okay, 2 more slides. A V-plow. You see I love the V-plow. But look at this object. Doesn't this look like it should be on the head of Minerva, right? I mean, this is like a headdress for a god. And how with the dust on it, you can see the kind of the segmentation of what at first glance seems a smooth blade. There is accidental but really gorgeous art in some of the objects that are essential to basic functions like snow removal. And when I mentioned that FEL operators can be like dancers, right? That they are choreographing with equipment. two FELs kissing hello. This was a staged photo. Michael Anton is the photographer for the Department of Sanitation. Many of these pictures are his. As you see, he's quite a talented photographer, and he's passionate about the department and about his work. But there are moments in storm response for some play, at least once the worst of the storm is over. That's my talk. I'm happy to take questions and have a conversation with you about anything. As I said, this is the first time I've done this talk, so there are missing parts and pieces.